Welcome to Ionic tutorial. I'm Jayesh Lahare. This is video number 23. In this session, we will learn about promise and observable feature of AngularJS, which we generally used in Ionic framework, and at the same time, we will learn different features of promise and observable. So we will see its implementation, that how we can use in our application and how we can what is the best option we can provide our application to use in different scenarios, like whether to use promise or observable. So let's talk about the promise first. So promise is a AngularJS component which provides two scenarios. First is success and another one is error. So whether promise returns you either it's a success or error. So in case of success, you need to override its then method, and in then method it returns you all the possible values. And in case of error, you can catch the error using catch function, and in that method you can print the errors. So promise tells you that whether it's a success or error, and these are the basic functionalities which promise returns. So in this session we will learn only the basic of promise and observable, and we will see that how to implement them. So promise always return a single value. Like if you call any function, for example, if you call any network function, then you can implement promise over there, because if you call any web service or any URL, then definitely it's going to return a single value or single response according to one request. So you can implement promise in that case. And second option is promise is asynchronous. It means if you are executing any option using promise, then it will not freeze your UI, and it will not impact the performance of the application. So asynchronous means the code is working in background, and when it's completed, it will return its value. So it will not block the current operation. That's called asynchronous behavior. Now promise is not lazy. It means when you invoke the promise, it's going to return the value. You cannot cancel it. So when you invoke the promise, it's going to return the value anyhow, whether you accept that value into some variable or not. So it's going to return. And the last one is promise cannot be cancelled once it's executed. It means if you invoke any promise function, then definitely it will return you then and catch functionality. So you cannot cancel it once you execute the operation. So that is the promise, which you will see. Now the next one is observable. So observable is somewhat similar to promise, but its functionality is a little bit different. Like promise, in case of promise, it was returning us two different methods. One is then and catch, but in case of observable, it works according to the callback function. So whether there is an error or any success scenario, it's always going to tell you, or it is always going to return that response in case of that callback function. So if we talk about the observable may return multiple value over period of time. So we have seen that promise returns only a single value according to single request, but in case of observable, it's not compulsory or it's not mandatory. In case of observable, it might return multiple value one by one after some duration, some interval or some duration or some period of time. Then observable is asynchronous again, just like promise, and observable is lazy. Lazy means once you invoke the observable returns only value when you subscribe it, when you ask for it. So not like a promise. Like in case of promise, it always return the value no matter what. But in case of promise, in case of observable, it only returns value when you subscribe it. So that's why it called observable is lazy. The last one is observable can be cancelled. It means if you have invoked certain operations and you want to cancel it, then you can terminate that operation using unsubscribe method. But in case of promise, it's not feasible. but in case of observable it can be possible. So this is the difference between promise and observable. Promise returns single value, whereas observable returns multiple value over a period of time. Then both are asynchronous in nature. It means they do not block the user operations in UI, or they do not block the current operation. They always runs in background. And third one is promise is not lazy, observable is lazy. It means promise returns the value no matter whether you ask for it or not. Once you invoke it, it will return you value. But in case of observable, until you do not subscribe, it's not going to return any value. So we will see in our application that how we can implement this behavior in a few moments. And the last one is promise cannot be cancelled once it's executed. But in case of observable, you can cancel it when it's started using unsubscribe method. So let's see the UI and our application in which we will implement the promise and observable. So this is the basic UI I have created, in which you can see there are two different blocks. This block is like a promise result. If I insert any value, say 3 and 4, and if I click on test promise, then it will return me value non-favorite result. So this is the situation which I am catching this error. This is the error in catch block of a promise. But if I increase the value over here, let's say 7, then it will return me favorite result. And in a moment we will see what is promise race. Promise race is just like you are iterating different promises, and the winner of promise is always entertained first. So we'll see in a moment. Then observable. In case of observer, when you start it, it will keep returning you value just like this. It's returning me value 1, 2, 3, 4, etc. And over here you can see that. So you can see, you can implement the observable in case where you are continuously returning certain values. For example, if you have implemented geolocation, then in case of geolocation, latitude, longitudes are always returned at certain level of intervals. So in that case of scenario, or in this case, you can implement the observer. But if you just want one request and one response, then you can go ahead with promise. So that's the difference, basic difference between observer and promise. And observer can be stopped, like here you can see that it's continuously printing, it's continuously returning me value. So if I click over here, stop observer, it will stop showing that value, because my observer has stopped giving me values. And if I click over it again, it will give me value again. On clicking on stop, it's stopped now. So let's see how we can implement observer and promise. So let's create application. Ionic start. I will name it promise observe, and I will use blank template. Okay, it looks like project is created. Now let's go inside project directory and let's hit the Ionic serve command. So we can test our promise and observable without any UI in application, but for tutorial purpose, let's create a basic UI so that it will look good. So meanwhile the Ionic serve command is running, so let's go to our project directory and let's delete that template part, and let's create our own UI. So let's go to home.html, and over here I will delete this. Okay, now it looks like it's started, so I'll minimize it. Let's delete this template and let's create the UI. So first let's test the promise function. So in this case I will create two input blocks. Let's say input type equal to, I will use number. So in this session we will use promise and we will check whether it's a prime number or not, or we can check whether it's an even number or odd number. So let's create this app for even and odd number. Let's bind it also, and g model equal to, I will call it param1, and I will close it. So, param1 and param2. Okay, let's save it. Okay, we have two input text or text boxes. Now let's create two buttons, or let's create one button, and button ion button. And I will call it test promise. Save it. Let's make this button full. Okay, now let's bind it also. So on click event, I will bind it with certain function. Click equal to, let's create a function called promise test, and let's pass these two values which we received from these two input text. So the name of this first input text model value is param1, so I will pass param1. The second value is param2. Now let's create this function. I will save it. I will just copy this, and let's go to home.ts file. So this is HTML file, and let's go to its corresponding home.ts file. And over here, let's create function called promise test, and it will accept two parameters. So I will simply call it a of type number, and second one of type number again. So we have created this promise test function. Now inside our app, we can take the help of provider also, so our code will look a little bit better. Like, I don't want to put any business logic over here in home.ts file. So for that, I will go to command prompt, and I will terminate this Ionic sub command, and let's create one provider. Ionic generate provider, and I will call it data, or I will just call it math. Okay, so math provider is added into our application. Let's hit the Ionic sub command again. So in provider section, we have this provider called math.ts file. So over here, let's write our promise logic. So for that, first let's create a function. So I will create a function called get promise, and it will again accept two parameters. One is number a, and another one is again number. So this function is going to return a promise, and in that promise we are going to tell a caller function whether the given function is equal to or not equal to. So in our scenario, if a and b value is equal, then we will provide positive response, but if it's not, then we will return error case. So let's specify the return type. So I will specify over here promise, and you can specify any, or you can specify number also. So I'm returning any, because in case of any you can return anything. So let's create promise. I will call let p equal to new promise, and in promise there are two things we need to specify. One is resolve and another one is reject. So we have specified resolve and reject. Now over here simply equal to greater than sign, and then here is the implementation. So in this, here we have to specify the implementation. So here we will put our logic. If a and b is equal with each other, then we will return positive, otherwise we will return negative result. So we will put here condition if a equal to b. So if both are equal, then we will resolve. Let's say resolve, and in resolve let's say both numbers are equal. If they are not, then in else we will return error. Let's say reject. If you want to return the error, then you have to reject. You have to call the reject function, and within that you have to specify oops, numbers are not equal. So we have specified this thing. Now in the end, this is the complete implementation of promise. So we have to return this promise also. That's why this one is giving the error, because this is the return type and we have not returned anything in this function. So over here use return p, and we are done. So in provider we have implemented our get promise logic. So let's delete these default things. I do not want this thing. You can delete this HTTP client also, because it's not required in our case. So let's go to home.ts file. So before going to writing anything in home.ts file, make sure your math provider is imported into app.module.ts file. So here you can see that as I created it, it's already imported. I will copy it, and its entry math provider should be available in provider section also. So it's already written over here. So let's go to home.ts file, and in constructor let's provide math provider. Let's call it math. Okay, so as I implement this math and math provider, the import is already added over here. So this will happen if you are using latest version of Visual Studio Code. Otherwise you have to import, or you have to write this line manually. So we have imported this one. Now let's create our logic. So over here let's call our providers function. So I will call this dot math dot get promise. Get promise is our function, and inside the get promise I will return these two parameters. And now over here I have two scenarios, then and catch. So if I use first, let's implement the then case, and in then let's call it data, and in data let's show the alert, and in alert let's print that data value as it is. Then the last case is catch. In case of catch, again let's catch the error and print that error in alert. So let's print over here error is, and over here success. Save it. Okay, this is giving error. It's saying error static injector HTTP client, because we have added this provider, and in this provider section here you can see that it's importing HTTP client. So it's not required in our case, so I will delete this line, and let's delete this one also and save it. And make sure you have used save all also. Okay, so I will put some values, let's say 4 and 5, and let's hit the test promise. So here you can see that it's saying error is oops, number are not equal. So this come into the catch part, and this catch part is mapped to the our reject case. So here you can see that it's showing me oops, numbers are not equal, but if I enter the same value, then it will say success, both numbers are equal. So resolve case is over here. So we have successfully integrated promise in our case. Now there is another functionality, basic things, which is provided by promise, which is called race. So race is a function which executes multiple promises, and when any promise returns value in very first, or you can say the winner promise, then it return you the value of that particular promise. So let's see how to implement the promise race in our application. So for that, let's go to home.html file and let's create one button. So I will copy this line and let's call it promise race, and let's rename it. So in this case we do not require any parameters, so I will just simply create this function promise race, and let's create that function in home.ps file also. Now let's create its logic inside our math.ts file. So in math.ts file, let's create another function. I will call it test race. So in this case, we are not going to show anything in alert. So for that we will require the help of console. So for that, right click over inspect and let's open the console element. So here it will print everything. We do not need alert in this case. So to check the race, for that let's create one promise. Let's say variable promise1 equal to new promise, and inside promise we have to create one function, and this function will take resolve and reject. Now let's create one more promise. I will call it promise2, and inside this function either you can resolve or reject. So in our case I will first use resolve. So let's use resolve. I will call it hello from promise1, and let's copy this line, hello from promise2. Now below that, let's create promise.raise. so over here you have to call promise.raise function, and inside raise you had to provide all the promises which are racing with each other. So I will call first promise 1 comma, I will then promise 2, and after that here again we have then and catch scenario. So for then scenario, let's call then, and inside then value, and over here let's print data, or let's print value as it is. And in case of catch, again let's print the error as it is. Now let's call this provider's test trace function in our home.ts file. So over here simply call this dot math dot test trace, and we are done. Now let's save it. Okay, so if I click this button, then this function is going to execute. So let's see what happened when we click over here. So here you can see that now it's saying hello from promise 1. Okay, so in promise race, promise 1 is always executed. If I make it reject, and I'll say error. So it will say hello from promise 1 again. So basically over here you can see that in promise race the winner is promise 1 always. So if you delay it a little bit, let's make it resolve again, and to delay it we have to call set timeout function, which is again a part of JavaScript or Angular. So we will call set timeout, and in set timeout we will call resolve, and delay is 100 millisecond, and here I will call hello from promise 1. Now let's see who will be the winner. So here I have given some delay of 100 millisecond, and in promise 2 there is no delay. So let's see who will be the winner in these two cases. So let's save it. If I click over here you can see that now it's saying hello from promise 2. So it's this one is printing, this one is not, because in execution of this promise 1 there is a delay of 100 millisecond. So there is a delay and it's executing in the last, so that's why it's not this promise.raise function is not entertaining to promise 1. So same case, if like I just copy this one and let's comment this resolve section, and let's say 2, and I increase the delay by 200 and I save it, then let's see who will be the winner. So in case of promise 1 there is a delay of 100 millisecond in execution, and in execution of promise 2 there is a delay of 200 millisecond. So if I click over here you can see that now it's saying hello from promise 1. It means in this case the winner is promise 1 and it has executed this function. because it is a very small delay which is 100 millisecond, and in case of promise 2 there is a large delay which is 200 millisecond, and definitely in this case promise 2 is not going to win. So if I increase it a little bit, let's say 300 millisecond, and I save it, and if I click over it, then you can see that the promise 2 is the winner in this case, because 200 millisecond delay is less than 300 milliseconds. So promise 2 is the winner in this case. So this is the condition promise.race you can implement in your scenario, in which for example there is a scenario where you are downloading image from multiple URL or multiple server, and you want to show the image which is coming from any of the server very first. So in that kind of scenario you can implement promise race scenario, and you can implement the image showing logic. So in that case, if for example there are two servers, Google server and Amazon server, and the same image is kept on Google and Amazon. So if you're in your code you want to show that image, and user it do not care with the user whether that image is coming from Amazon or Google. So if image is downloaded from Google in the beginning, then let's show it, otherwise let's skip it. So in that scenario you can implement promise.race. So we have seen that how to implement the promise race. Now let's see how we can implement the subscriber functionality. So for that, let's create the UI first. So over here I will simply give some line break, then let's create one paragraph which will print some value. Let's bind some value, let's show some value, and let's create two buttons. Button of full type, and I will call it start. Now let's create another button, stop, and at the same time let's bind this button with some event. Let's say click event equal to start and stop. Save it. So we have start and stop button. Now let's create these two function in home.ts file. Start and stop. Now let's implement our subscriber or observable pattern. So for that, let's create one function in math.ts file. Let's create this function in top of the file. So I will call this function get tick because it's returning me timer value, and this will return a observable to which user will subscribe. So for that I will call it observable of type any. Okay, make sure when you implement this observable you import this thing in the top of the header. So for that we have to create observable dot create and inside create it return observer. So this is going to return the observer. So we have to hold it in certain some variable. So let's say observer ID equal to, so let's make it global because user might unsubscribe to that this observable. So let's create this variable on top of the file, observable of type any, and here let's delete this and let's call it this dot. So this function is going to return this observer. So for that case, let's hold the value of this observer again, and for that let's create one observer, my observer of type any, and over here let's write this dot my observer equal to observer. Okay, so this is giving error because we are not returning anything. So in that case we have to call return this dot observer ID and save it. So get tick function will be called from our home.ts file in start function. So in start function, let's say let's call it this dot math dot get tick, and over here if you press the dot it will say subscribe. So if you subscribe it, then it's going to return data, and let's print this data inside this this value. So we have not created any variable. The variable name was value, so let's copy it and let's declare over here of type any. Then here let's call this dot value equal to data. So when we save it, and when we click over start button, nothing will happen because we are not returning anything right now. So to return anything, okay, let's implement the stop button, also stop or unsubscribe also. So for that we have to hold this this get tick function is going to return certain ID. So for that let's create one more variable called ID of type any, and over here simply use this dot ID equal to this one. So we have ID of that observable which is returning any value. So if you want to stop that observable, then we can use this dot ID dot unsubscribe. So in case of unsubscribe, our subscriber will stop returning any value. Unsubscribe. Okay, so we have this. Now let's go to our mat.ts file, and when any user subscribe to our observable, then this method will execute, and over here we have to start certain value which will keep returning certain value at particular duration of interval. So let's create one interval, let's create one timer. For that let's create start timer method inside it, and let's call this method start timer when any user subscribe to our observer. Okay, so now we have started a timer. So in case of timer, let's call any function, let's say tick, and tick. And in tick, like, you can take the help of set timeout function, which will keep calling our set timeout, let's say X, and over here let's create one more boolean function, is running. So we have to stop it also. Let's make it false. So inside this function we will check if this dot is running equal to true. If it's true, then call this function again, and over here you have to pass certain value. Let's say this dot my observer dot next, hello. So hello will be single value, but we have to return number of values. So for that, let's create one more function, one more variable. Let's say count of type any equal to 0. Hello plus count. This dot count. Okay, here also this dot tick function, and in the last we have to provide the duration of delay. So let's use 500 millisecond. Now let's see what happened. I have saved everything. When I start it, okay, it's not returning anything because we have not started this timer. So for that, the value of this is running is false by default. So when we call this tick function, before that we will call this dot is running equal to true. So our timer will start giving us value. So let's save it. Let's start it. So it has returned only single value, it's not returning multiple value because this set timeout function called only once. So we have, if we want to call it multiple times, so for that let's use the recursion and let's call this function again, this dot tick, and save it. So when it will return count, let's increase the value of count by 1. This dot count equal to this dot count plus 1, and save it. Now let's create our start. So here you can see that now it's returning, it has started giving me the value, and this value is returned from over here. So this ways our observable work. Now if I click over stop, then it has stopped, but my timer is still working in background. So for that, what we have to do is we have to implement the stop method, stop timer, and to stop the timer simply call this dot is running equal to false. So we have implemented this dot stop timer function. Now in home.ts file, when user unsubscribe, after that you have to call this dot math dot stop timer also, otherwise that timer will keep running in background. Start. And stop. So when I click start again, stop. So this is the scenario which you can implement in your code. So in today's session we have learned that how to use how and when to use promise and subscriber. Like there is only single value you are returning to your in your business logic, then use the promise. Otherwise, if there is a scenario where you want to keep posting certain values to a caller function, then go ahead with the subscriber or observable, which is provided by Angular framework. So thanks for watching, and for more updates and more videos, subscribe to my channel as more videos are in queue. And if you have any queries or any comment, write to my video section, and if you have any feedback, then most welcome. So thanks for watching. Bye bye, have a nice day.